Dr. Paquette, ladies and gentlemen of the Alexander Hamilton Institute, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today and for the invitation to participate in the General Josiah Bunting Lecture Series. There's no need to tell any of you that General Bunting had an exceptional military and scholarly career, demonstrating a balance that is both sorely needed and increasingly rare in today's military. I'm genuinely honored to deliver these remarks in an event named in his honor. Recognizing that this is a military history lecture series, I beg your indulgence for what follows as I take a few liberties with that general topic. What I would like to speak about today is not the origin story of Veterans Day, but instead about today's veterans. There is certainly a historical component to my comments, informed as they are by the recent history of 2 decades of conflict. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq have dominated my own professional career, as they have the military journeys of all the veterans produced over the past 20 years. In my case, they account for 6 combat deployments and nearly 5 years of fighting in the Middle East. But my intent today is not to recount the ups and downs of those wars. Instead, I'd like to shine a light on the veterans themselves, the people whose service we honor today. They are truly the living products of recent military history, and I fear that they are becoming increasingly misunderstood by the society that they volunteered to protect. Now, you might ask why this matters. On the one hand, the fact that we have a day set aside to honor military service to the nation is in and of itself a great thing. The holiday, as you heard, evolved from the original Armistice Day, recognizing those that served in World War I, and in 1954 expanded to recognize all those that had served in the armed forces. However, over time, the common experience of service in the Great Wars in a military that was conscripted in large numbers and was generally representative of a large swath of society from all corners of the nation evolved. The shift to an all-volunteer force after Vietnam meant that military service was no longer as representative of our society as it once was. Enlistment in the armed forces was a calling for some, a path to higher education for others, an economic opportunity for many. But for all those that served, it was an option. And over the ensuing decades, our common connection to the veteran, whether next door or in our own family, became more distant. As that relationship became more and more tenuous, the general understanding of what it means to be a veteran in a period of war started to fade. In other words, while the holiday remained very much the same, the people it recognizes have changed significantly. And so too has the nature of the combat they experienced. Societal perceptions of what it means to be a veteran today are either informed by distant memories of wars that would frankly be unrecognizable by a modern veteran, or worse, they're colored by a cartoon version of combat served up in a media that exaggerates the exploits of a very few, but at a great disservice to the many who have served. Our contemporary veteran has served almost exclusively in a period of conflict, deploying and redeploying in first 12, and then 15, and finally 9-month cycles. The conflicts they served in, whether Iraq, Afghanistan, or in many cases both, ended inconclusively, certainly not in clear or certain victory. For most, these conflicts were marked not by sustained periods of intense combat, but defined by training local forces, enduring sporadic and often poorly aimed rocket attacks, and bracing with every trip outside the wire of your local base possibility of an improvised explosive device detonating in your path. The risk of dying from an insider attack, of having weapons provided by our own government being turned against us by an apparent ally, was ever present, even if relatively infrequent. For veterans of the post-9/11 generation, these were different sorts of wars. And these differences matter. They matter because the popular view of the veteran as a wounded, traumatized, broken man or woman does them a disservice. They matter because when we stop viewing our veterans as citizens, as one of us, and instead consider them a separate breed, we fail to tap into the enormous potential inherent in these men and women who want to continue a life of service to their community. Perhaps most importantly, they matter because, as I see every day in my current role running an organization that's dedicated to helping our service members transition back into civilian life, the gap between how society views veterans and how veterans view themselves is an impediment, not only to successful reintegration, but to our overall approach to the use of force as an instrument of national power. Let me first turn to the character of war over the past 20 years. And to begin with, the experience of combat, I will admit, is an intensely personal one for every single veteran. What I saw or did in one part of Iraq or Afghanistan would often be markedly different from that of a fellow soldier, even just a few miles away. To make this even more complicated, in both these conflicts, the overlapping dynamics of competing clans, tribes, and family affiliations made for a battlefield that constantly evolved. Even when coming back to the same area on multiple deployments, the only constant was often the lay of the land. The few local leaders who did survive across multiple deployments had often changed sides, some more than once. And they operated on a political logic or a tribal calculus that we were never truly able to grasp. When combined with a rotational deployment model that had at its longest units serving in an area for 15 months, and at its shortest units rotate out every 4 months at a time, to say that we fought 20 separate wars 1 year at a time would not be an unreasonable assessment. That makes it very difficult, if not simply inappropriate, to generalize combat experience. It makes it difficult for a veteran to adequately convey what they did or felt or achieved. I'd ask you to compare this to the popular conception of war as a clash between two uniformed groups with defined lines, each striving to knock each other out of position in the pursuit of some key piece of terrain or perhaps a critical building or a city of strategic import. I know that this audience inherently understands that a textbook description of warfare serves as a poor descriptor for fighting an insurgency. But my sense is that for society at large, that distinction is not so clear. For example, in the popular media, which for most serves as the primary frame of reference for contemporary combat, even there, the bad guys all dress the same, with the black turban replacing the black hat of early Westerns, to identify the bad guys in the story more clearly for the audience. As is the nature of any insurgency, our adversaries did not often wear uniforms. They blended with the local populace. They hid inside mosques and placed their headquarters in hospitals. They rarely acknowledged or abided by the rules of the game as defined by the Geneva Convention or the law of armed conflict. This dynamic emerges as a defining characteristic of the post-9/11 veteran experience. On the ground, these were wars of exceptional emotional and moral confusion. Unlike the wars of the greatest generation, of Korea and even of Vietnam to some lesser extent, the veterans' experience in the post-9/11 era was also different when it came to physical conflict with the enemy. That's not to say that we haven't had some pitched battles over the past 2 decades. Fallujah, Samara, Helmand Province all come to mind. However, these examples are notable in that they are largely the outliers from the pattern rather than the norm. Even in periods of intense combat by American troops, the majority of U.S. service members in theater never actually personally saw an enemy combatant. Even fewer fired their weapon in anger. In combat, conventional forces, which compose the vast majority of troops deployed, were often employed in supporting roles to our special operations forces, who took on the direct action role, hunting down high priority targets and engaging in firefights. Instead, combat for most of our service members was a much more insidious, impersonal affair. It was first encountered through rocket and mortar attacks launched from kilometers away. These were often homemade weapons laid on a tube or honestly simply set on a pile of rocks and aimed in the general direction of a forward operating base, initiated by a timer. The indiscriminate nature of these attacks and the fact that the enemy that employed them was usually nowhere to be found when the strikes occurred turned what was fortunately a fairly ineffective physical effect to a weapon of significant psychological impact. A second favorite tactic of our adversaries was the use of the improvised explosive device, or IED. For all those that traversed the roads and trails of Iraq and Afghanistan, fighting against an often unseen opponent meant adapting to constant uncertainty, bringing forth in most an emotion bordering on dread. It meant acknowledging to yourself that every trip outside the confines of a base brought with it the chance to encounter an IED. And while these weapons started as fairly rudimentary mines or even common milk jugs packed with explosives, buried in a roadside and usually detonated through a simple pressure plate, they quickly grew in effectiveness. The explosively formed penetrator, when it arrived on the battlefield, added another layer of lethality. These machined copper plates, when placed in front of an IED, allowed for an explosive blast to be directional. As the copper plate was liquefied by the explosive force, it produced sufficient kinetic energy to pierce even our most hardened vehicles. The ways IEDs were employed also evolved, adding first detonation by wire and later mobile phone. Resorting to such tactics and weapons was a tacit acknowledgement on the part of our enemies that they simply could not compete with U.S. forces in head-to-head battle. So they adapted. That's what insurgents do. And in fact, you have to search pretty hard to find any evidence of a tactical defeat of American forces over the entire course of these two wars. Small outposts may have been overrun at times, but even these were retaken within days, if not hours. However, the impersonal nature of these attacks, ineffective as they generally were, still took a toll on our forces. When we did take casualties from an IED or a rocket, there was often no enemy to fight back against, no defense to mount. They were weapons of simple probability, and whether a rocket hit 5 meters away or 500 was often a matter of chance or luck. When IEDs were hidden in the ubiquitous piles of trash along Iraqi or Afghan roads, finding them in advance was exceptionally difficult, if not simply impossible at times. But hit them we did, and often with calamitous results. It was this combination of factors bordering on the random that I offer as a second characteristic of the contemporary veteran's experience. Fighting against an enemy that frequently chose not to take the field, spending nights wondering if the rockets would be fired, and if they were fired, what they might hit, worrying that every routine trip down the road might end abruptly with the explosion of an IED. That our casualties from these attacks were extremely low when compared to losses taken in earlier wars, I think understates the toll of living under this constant blanket of uncertainty. In some sense, these wars violated our sense of fighting fair. They are the reason why many veterans still scan the roadside or look at the overpass when they're driving down the highway, or maybe jump a little when they hear a loud noise. Their whole experience of combat was at once random and impersonal. Finally, in terms of general characteristics describing their experience in a military at war, for most veterans, our recent conflicts lack a sense of closure. At a tactical level, for many that served, deployments were spent training local forces, building up a police unit, establishing a border patrol, or equipping an army. Others spent months attempting to first eradicate opium and then replace it with other crops, only to later have to figure out how to live with opium as the subsistence crop of choice for local Afghan farmers. Today's veterans embedded into local Afghan or Iraqi units. They drank inhuman amounts of chai, and they attempted to craft fighting forces capable of defending themselves, or develop employment programs to keep young military-age men off the streets. steering them away from joining the opposition simply for the lack of better options. That we tried all these things by mirroring our own experiences and values and imposing them on societies so different from our own is the subject for a different lecture for a different day. But whether the model was misguided or not, however, takes nothing from the well-intentioned and often Herculean efforts of our service members to achieve the goals laid out for them. Now, along the way, there were some remarkable accomplishments. By our securing local streets and imposing some sense of order, women and children in these countries were able to go back to school and in many cases to work. Clean water was delivered to villages desperately in need. Small business initiatives were funded and local industry actually flourished for periods of time. Schools and hospitals were built. Today's veterans rightly can and do take pride in these achievements. However, even this progress largely proved transitory. Partner forces tended to evaporate at the first real sign of danger. Countless amounts of weapons and equipment found their way into the wrong hands. Police officers, graduates of our rigorous training and later our ethics programs, became part of the problem rather than a much needed solution, imposing tariffs on local roads for travelers and selectively enforcing the law, often only on members of opposing ethnic groups or on those unable to pay a bribe. In other words, lasting progress at the tactical level seems something of a mirage, visible from a distance but quickly evaporating under closer inspection. It caused our veterans to question whether the losses we sustained were worth the cost. At the strategic level, and despite efforts to create one, there was no mission accomplished moment. Iraq and more recently Afghanistan ended with a whimper rather than with a bang, and left today's veterans asking if it was all worthless, if those we lost died in vain. According to a 2019 Pew Research study, almost 60% of veterans say the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were not worth fighting. The lack of clear outcomes, the inability to say we won a war or defeated an enemy, leaves contemporary veterans in an uncomfortable space. I think it fair to presume that the vast majority value their time in uniform. They take pride and support that they gave to the comrades on their left and their right, and they miss the camaraderie born out of shared experiences and serving a purpose larger than any one individual. However, those feelings are somewhat out of place, embedded as they are in a larger public narrative that questions whether the entire effort actually achieved any lasting progress. In sum, the combat experiences that shaped those new veterans we celebrate today are markedly different than those from prior eras. Service in the post 9/11 era meant fighting in wars of moral and emotional confusion, under conditions of random and impersonal violence, and devoid of any sense of clear victory or even sustainable achievement. That does not make this generation of veterans more or less than veterans of our prior conflicts, nor does it give them greater stature than those that served exclusively in peacetime. However, it does make them different. And it is not clear to me that those differences are fully understood by the nation that they served. At the same time, respect for the military remains at all-time highs. Almost reflexively, and unlike for some past generations, servicemen and women have come to be regarded as heroes, constantly, and I do believe genuinely thanked for their service, even as an understanding of what actually constituted that service became more and more murky. Military family reunions are now fixtures at sporting events and on social media. Walking through an airport in uniform evolved into something of an uncomfortable social obstacle course, as service members struggle with an appropriate response to thank you for your service. And I have to say, you're welcome, it just feels awkward and inappropriate, This elevation to hero status that service members enjoyed while in uniform, certainly a source of pride, unintentionally served to further isolate them as veterans. In shedding the uniform and transitioning back to civilian life, they were suddenly back to standing in line with everyone else to board the plane and buying their own drinks at the bar. For many, this loss of identity and public recognition can be quite jarring. The number of veterans reporting difficulties transitioning back to civilian life has doubled in the post 9/11 era, accounting for nearly 50% today. This national holiday serves as a counterbalance to that, as we pause as a nation to recognize all those that served in our armed forces. What they accomplished while in uniform is hardly diminished by the fact that those days are now behind them. The dissonance experienced by the veteran, however, does highlight the gap that exists between public adoration for a uniform in the abstract and the disconnect many veterans perceive between themselves and their fellow citizens. Even as we placed our military men and women on a social pedestal, those fighting our nation's wars represented a diminishing percentage of the general population. Members of the military are consistently overrepresented by young men and women from rural communities and from less economically prosperous regions. Locating many of our bases in the more affordable real estate of the southern United States decades ago has only served to reinforce this trend. Recruiting in major urban areas continues to lag. Living in an area without a military base or a significant peacetime presence meant that many who might have considered military service were simply not exposed to the idea in a tangible way. They had no friends or neighbors serving, no human connection to the military. Lingering beliefs in some communities that military service was only for those with no other good option, for someone else's kids, certainly didn't help. Nor did the drumbeat from all forms of media that wartime service meant that you would come back from the experience broken, suffering from mental health issues or missing a limb. Now, there's no doubt that serving over the past 20 years has impacted our veterans deeply. Some are visibly wounded. Others carry those wounds deep inside, and we owe them the best care we can possibly provide. Despite some well-known inefficiencies in the systems meant to do that, I can sit here today and attest that there is certainly no lack of resources or effort or sincere intentions to do just that. But coming out of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, wounded veterans represent only a fraction of those that served. They certainly should not be the predominant image conjured up in our national conversation about military service and the veterans produced over the last 20 years. The convergence of all these factors, along with 2 decades of being a nation at war, saw military service become less an expression of service before self, or a citizen's opportunity to serve their fellow Americans, and morphed into something of a family business. Nearly 80% of those serving today report having a family member that served, even as less than 1% of the general population joins the military. As a result, fewer and fewer Americans personally knew someone serving. And despite exceptional and well-intended outreach efforts, military bases became gated communities within the larger national fabric. I don't feel that this separation of the military is healthy, either for our society or our veterans. It reinforces a view that all those who served in uniform were somehow categorically different, rather than citizens choosing to serve the nation, just like doctors or firefighters or social workers. It can produce an unhealthy sense of entitlement or otherness in veterans, while feeding into the view that veterans are somehow damaged by their experiences rather than strengthened by them. It allows the veteran to be defined by popular culture or the media, by turns glorifying some aspects of their service while ignoring others, but never accurately delivering the truth. These clashing images pose real problems for veterans as they reintegrate back into the community, and in turn feed into difficulties broadening the appeal of military service for all those that are capable and would perhaps otherwise be inclined to serve. Maybe most important, when we allow ourselves to view those who serve or have served differently than we do our neighbors, we risk failing to give deliberations about future uses of military force sufficient gravity. The lack of anything more than a superficial connection to those put in harm's way can make the weight of those decisions deceptively easier. If wearing a uniform becomes something only others do, others who are following a family tradition, rather than a broader opportunity as citizens to serve the country that we all love, does it not make the use of military force in pursuit of our national objectives dangerously abstract? Further, I would argue we live now in a world where a return to conscription is not really feasible. The time it takes to train someone on the range of highly technological systems in our arsenal is now much, much greater. And I think it's entirely fair to question whether mass conscription would be fast enough or effective enough to make even a marginal difference as we move back into an era of potential great power war, all long before we have any discussion of how a wartime draft would fare politically. However, this Veterans Day for me is not about sharing a depressing view of the present. It's instead my attempt to recalibrate our collective thinking, to provide a counterpoint to a prevailing view. Today is an opportunity to think positively about our veterans, respected for their service, thanked for their sacrifice to be sure, but fully embraced as fellow citizens. The overwhelming majority of veterans are confident, they're capable, they're ready to return to their hometowns with pride in what they have done, ready to take the next steps in their lives as civilians. This is only truly possible when we think of them as one of us, carrying a very different set of experiences, but also a learned set of skills in leadership and responsibility and teamwork that can only be cultivated in an institution like the United States military. The wars of the past 2 decades have shaped the modern veteran. As in every war we fight, their collective experiences are different from those that came before them. In trying to describe them today, I hope to share some sense of why explaining what their wars were like is so hard for a veteran to articulate, and even harder to convey accurately and adequately to those that weren't there. We would all benefit from understanding these wars better, for in doing so, we better understand the veterans that fought in them. The conversations that might build that common understanding of the veteran experience are less frequent as our connections to the military become more tenuous, but they remain important, and we should seek out opportunities to have them. In doing so, I submit that you would find the veteran next door is very much like every other American on your block. In closing, I just have to say, I loved serving with soldiers, and I have cherished every moment of that time over 3 decades in uniform. I love them for who they are. They are not Spartans. They are not charity cases. Our veterans are representative of the very best of America. Now, they're not perfect by any stretch, but they came together in a shared sense of purpose and mission, often under terrible conditions. And when the chips were down and the bullets were flying, they risked their lives for one another, regardless of gender or color or religion. There's nothing more American for me than that. I'd just like to thank you so much for your time and your attention today. It is truly humbling to have had the opportunity to speak with you, to honor all those who wore the cloth of this great nation, whether in peacetime or in war. Thank you all, and happy Veterans Day.